Welcome back to EDIT 640. It's Joe here again to present this week's module on lighting for instructional video productions. In this lesson, we'll learn about the types of lights available for both professional and independent filmmakers. We'll review the basics on light bulb technology so you know what options are appropriate for specific production needs. Then we'll examine the science and art of diffusion to help producers avoid harsh shadows on their subjects. And finally, we'll study the universal principle of three-point lighting, and then discuss how you can implement that technique on a zero budget. Generally speaking, there are four different categories of lights that instructional video producers tend to use. Those that are on camera, floodlights, spotlights, and panels. We'll take a real quick look at each one of these. Some of the higher end cameras come with on-camera lights that are built in right in front of the viewfinder typically. These are usually LED lights, and often they're combined with the built-in flash that's on the camera as well if it's a combination still photo and video camera. But nevertheless, they're very energy efficient, as you would expect for a battery-powered device. They therefore also have a very cool temperature. But unfortunately, they're very limited in range, and they're useful only really for medium close shots and tighter. Floodlights are some of the most powerful lights that you can find. They're also very cheap, but they're also very, very hot, and as you would expect, they're power hogs. Nevertheless, these are very, very accessible. Spotlights usually well beyond the budgets of most school and instructional productions, but in professional studios, these are very common. They're permanently installed, usually in the ceiling or on pedestals. They often have elaborate remote control systems, and as you'd expect, they're very, very expensive. Panel lights, also expensive, are very energy efficient. They use LEDs, and you can also get colored panels that can be completely programmable depending on the controllers, and that obviously adds to the expense. But the big difference here between panels and spotlights is that panels are highly portable. Most of them are designed to be pedestal mounted or rack mounted. Some of them even have gorilla grips on them so that you can mount them to virtually anything, sometimes suction cup mounts. In any event, these are relatively new compared to some of the other types and an increasingly popular option. Color is measured in degrees Kelvin, and although we can get very technical about this, it's well beyond the scope of this course. The simplistic understanding that you need to have right now is that institutional lighting tends to be bluish gray in tone. We think of the kinds of lights that are installed in the ceilings in a lot of the buildings that we occupy. That's indoor color balance. Daylight color balance or outdoor color balance tends to be more yellowish, orangish, reddish, simulating sunlight. It's a warmer feel to the lighting, and this difference in tone can be simulated in a lot of the lights that you can purchase. Tungsten light, for example, uses a bulb technology that's very hot, very bright. A lot of times they have barn doors associated with them. That's these things right down here that you can flap closed to reduce the amount of light that is exposed on your subject. These tend to be very inexpensive, and they're very lightweight, a lot of times pedestal mounted. HMI lights, holy cow, oh my goodness, nerd alert here. If you can pronounce that, I'll be very, very impressed. HMI lights are typically much more expensive, and this is the lighting technology that's inside a lot of your spotlights that are ceiling mounted in professional production studios. They can also be pedestal mounted, and they're definitely daylight balanced and incredibly bright and incredibly power hungry. So not something that most of us have access to unless we know somebody with a studio. LED lights, like we said before, are relatively new, and these tend to be still expensive, but they're very bright and they don't put off a whole lot of power, or excuse me, a whole lot of heat. Their power requirements are very minimal as well, so they're great portable options. They can even run off batteries, as we've talked about before, and they can be daylight balanced and even programmed and customized with certain control pads. You can see here in this image right here, some of the units will have color LEDs mixed in with and allow you to customize it for your particular needs. Fluorescent lights, this is probably the option that most of us have. These are incredibly cheap, relatively speaking. They don't put out much heat at all. The light is diffused. We'll talk about that in just a minute here. And the light can be daylight balanced. The older fluorescent institutional lighting is a lot more bluish gray in tone than the newer fluorescent lights, and many of you probably have these in your homes already. Speaking of homes, For most of us, for our instructional productions, household lighting is what we're going to end up using. For those of you who have desktop lamps, those make great spotlights and key lights. See the table lamp here with the shade here. These shaded lamps here offer great diffused lighting especially for placing behind your subject, and we'll talk about that in just a moment here. For those of you who have garages with shop lights, these can be very, very useful as well, and we'll talk about how we can put these together here in just a moment. Let's talk about a principle of lighting that's absolutely essential to reducing shadows across the faces of your subjects, and that's the principle of diffusion. There are two techniques that most instructional video producers tend to use when they're designing their lighting strategies: reflection and filtering. Here's what we're trying to avoid here, and this can work outdoor and indoor. In this outdoor sequence right here, you can see that we have a very bright background, and that creates its own set of problems with cameras that are auto exposed. We talked about that previously, but for lighting, this subject needs to be front lit. You can see how dark the shadows are in her face. You really can't see much. Contrast that with what we've done over here. All we did was simply take a reflector and bounce that light back at the subject, and suddenly she lights up in a much more appealing way. Indoor, same type of situation. Look at the harsh shadow you have behind here that I'm tracing with my mouse. There are a few shadows under the face as well, and it doesn't look like it's very front lit, and again, these shadows are so strong. Contrast that with what we have here. He's sitting in the exact same spot, but we simply change the way we're throwing the light on him. The light has been diffused, and when that light is diffused, it doesn't create these harsh shadows. So both of these principles we're going to look at in more detail right now. Let's talk about reflection first. Here's a typical scenario for an outdoor reflection shoot. You've got backlighting. Look at the shadow here. That means the light is behind him. So the light is coming down, bouncing off his bald head here, very, very shiny. So you've got to get him front lit, especially if this camera, which looks like it's a low budget camera, is trying to capture this image with all of this backlight, and hopefully there are enough trees back here to provide some sufficient contrast. Nevertheless, this reflector here simply bounces the light off and lights him up in the front and makes it much easier to view. This next photo is a good example of how you can do this on a really low budget for tight shots. Notice that the subject here is actually holding the reflector, and in this case the shot is so tightly framed that this isn't going to obviously be viewable to the audience. So keep that in mind. If you're worried about only having yourself and your subject, you can both hold that reflector as needed. Just frame accordingly. In indoor shots, we often use umbrella devices to bounce the light back on the subject. This is a great diffusion technique. If we were to take this spotlight right here and flip it around and blast it right here at the subject with that light and this light, there would be terrible shadows going across his face. Because there's a dark background here, we wouldn't see the shadows too badly. You would still see them, but it's the shadows on the face that would be very, very problematic, especially this side. So the solution then is to diffuse the light by bouncing it off a reflective item, and in most cases these umbrellas, which are very, very cheap, will do that very well. Filtering. Let's take a look at an outdoor shot here. In this particular sequence, you've got both a reflector set up right here, but we're also diffusing that light that's above her. You can see the shadow here, so the sun is directly overhead. Shooting at noon or anywhere in the middle of the day is usually very, very challenging because of the harsh shadows that come across the face of your subjects. And so one way that producers work around this is to diffuse it. Now, if we had stuck her in the shadows here behind the trees, those shadows would be across her face. So this is a really good decision to have this filter applied above her, shading her, in other words, but diffusing it enough so that those shadows don't create significant visual artifacts across the left side of her face. So that's going to look really good. We can do this indoor as well, obviously. Notice this time, for this particular shot, the umbrella is reversed. In this case, we're not reflecting the light for the umbrella. We're actually using the umbrellas as a diffuser. And I'll show you what you can use, or we'll talk about some cheap diffusion technologies. No, you don't have to go run out and buy an umbrella right now, although a regular umbrella, if you happen to have a white umbrella, would certainly work. The technology is not very sophisticated, but there's some other low budget options available, and we'll talk about those in just a second. Other filtering options available, and you see these a lot in professional studios. These aren't expensive, but you see this a lot for photographers, especially those who are doing product shoots. What I want you to see here is that you have what is not much more than just some fabric draped up in this box-like device. Here's where the product would go, and then the camera would be back behind here somewhere shooting this direction. Nevertheless, the light gets diffused as it is blasted through this sheet. And yes, for those of you thinking already, hey, I could do that with a bed sheet, yes you can, and we'll talk more about that shortly. Okay, excuse the cheesy model pose here. Another type of filtering that we haven't yet mentioned is the use of gels. Do you see this on the end of that light, and this right here, that red film, etc.? There's one over here as well. These are cheap sheets of plastic that are heat tolerant, that allow you to play with the different colors. And this is an old school technology for changing the aesthetic of the lighting that you're using. The newer version of this technology is simply to use LEDs, and that was like the panel lights that we saw earlier, with different colored bulbs in them. They're really not bulbs, but you know what I'm saying. They're light emitting diodes, and to program those using the controller to get just the right hue that you're looking for. The old school technique is to take these super cheap pieces of plastic and hang them over the lights, and you can still do that. Shower curtains, for example, colored shower curtains will allow you to do that, provided that you don't put it right on the lamp, because most shower curtains are not at all heat tolerant, and you'd melt right through that and create some kind of awful fire hazard. So please don't blow yourselves up while you're trying to do this on a low budget. But just know that you can diffuse light through a shower curtain. Very common low budget technique. Okay, let's talk about the principle of three-point lighting. This is really, really important. This is one of the fundamental techniques that most producers use, especially in interview segments, when they have a subject that's seated or standing, just not moving, and you can block them in a particular space on the set. Typically this is done with three different lights. The first is called a key light, the second is called a fill light, and the third is called a backlight, and they vary in intensity. The key light, as you would imagine, is the strongest, and it's always at an angle. It's never straight in front of the subject. That's really, really important. So this light dominates, going off to the right here. The camera is dead in front of them. The fill light, which is less intense than the key light, covers the other angle, and then you always have a backlight that's usually on the same side as your key light, but it's a much lower intensity. And it's important that it's a diffused light as well. You can see in this overview right here how the light works here. The key light lights up this side, the principal side of the face. The fill light will fill in those shadows that would form from this light, and then the backlight creates kind of this halo effect on the shoulders and the head that we're so used to seeing, even if we've never really paid much attention to it. Here's a good demonstration, and again, please excuse the cheesy model pose here, but these photos demonstrate this really well. If you blast one side at 45 degrees of your subject with your key light, this is what happens. You end up with these shadows over here on the right hand side, and that may be okay for Hollywood productions where you're trying to make the subject look villainous, but for our needs in instructional interviews, typically that's not very practical. When you add the backlight here, you can barely see what happens. It's very subtle. You can see that the right side of her hair here is lit up, and we've got a little bit of halo effect right here on that side of her neck. It's not until we put the fill light in here as well to take out some of those shadows on that side. You're still going to have a little bit of one right here, but she's much better lit up and much better exposed for this particular type of shot. So what does all of this mean to you, especially as you get ready to start your productions for your final projects here? I know that most of you are not going to have these sophisticated and expensive lights at your disposal, and that's fine. The good news is, if you apply these techniques, especially the three-point lighting technique, using even regular household lights, you can get away with excellent quality lighting in your productions. So here's some of the key things that I want you to take away from this particular presentation. Use reflectors or fill lights for backlit subjects or subjects that are in front of bright outdoor backdrops. This is so important when you're shooting outside. And you don't have to have access to those nice fancy reflectors. They're not expensive, but you can simply use poster board or a windshield dash protector that you buy for your car. Those make excellent reflectors. Shaded lamps are fantastic fill and backlights, as we mentioned earlier. So just position them according to the three-point lighting strategy. Shop lights make great key lights. Most of them are very powerful. Shower curtains, as we said earlier, are very, very cheap diffusers. Just again, don't put them on top of the light if there's any heat, because they will melt and you don't want a fire hazard. Bed sheets are great diffusers, but again, avoid the fire hazard. Same deal. Clothespins are fantastic for attaching especially bed sheets to strings. You can tie a piece of string from one side of the room to the other and then hang a sheet over it, pull it tight, and you've got a fantastic backdrop. Likewise, you can use it to create light diffusion as well and have the light shine actually through the sheet onto your subject. It just depends on what you're trying to do. Windshield covers and waxed poster boards, as we said, fantastic cheap reflectors. And that's going to conclude this lesson on the fundamentals of production lighting. Don't forget to return to the course website, where there are several additional videos about lighting that you need to view. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.